Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming out to the Barnes & Noble at BU tonight. New York Times bestselling author of Bringing Down the House joins us to talk about his newest release, Rig, the true story of an Ivy League kid who changed the world of oil from Wall Street to Dubai, which debuted on several bestseller lists. A self-described method writer, Ben Mezrich never intended to write a book about oil. As he states in his author's note, the stories that turn him on usually involve brilliant young kids pulling off incredible schemes. Wads of cash strapped to backs, Ferraris, and long-legged models and locales so exotic that I need the internet to help me find them on a map, quote. But a chance meeting with a Harvard Business School student named John D'Agostino led to a story he couldn't resist. Rigged is a story of the Merc Exchange, hotel palaces in Dubai, yachts with girls flown in by Saudi sheiks, and dangerous back alley dealings. Named People magazine's sexiest author, Ben Mezrich has written 9 books, including the bestsellers Bringing Down the House and Ugly Americans. In fact, Bringing Down the House was the basis for the 2008 Kevin Spacey movie 21 that was filmed here at BU. Ben Mezrich is a columnist for Stuff magazine and Boston Common, as well as a contributor to the UK magazine Flush. Please welcome Ben Mezrich.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And if you're wondering about the People magazine Sexiest Man thing, it's not that hard a competition. If you look at the other authors that I was competing against, it wasn't that rough. But rather than do a reading, I thought I was just going to tell you about how I got to here, how I got to writing Rigged. Which is kind of a departure for me because it's kind of political and serious, and I usually write pretty non-serious stuff. But I never set out to be a nonfiction writer. I never liked nonfiction. I always hated nonfiction. I used to watch really bad television, and I was into People magazine and Us Weekly and stuff like that. And when I sat down, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. So I actually graduated from Harvard, and I locked myself in an apartment on Marlborough Street in Back Bay. And I just started writing, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I wrote about 9 novels in about a year and a half. And they were all really bad. They were deep, dark, trashy novels that took place in bars in New York City. Because at the time I was reading a lot of Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney, and I thought, that's the kind of books, people read. And it really wasn't true. And I was sending them out and getting rejected and getting rejected. And I got about 190 rejection slips in a period of 2 years. Rejected by everybody in New York. I was even rejected by a janitor once because I sent a manuscript to an editor who was no longer working at a publishing house, and it ended up in the garbage, and the janitor took it out and read it and then rejected me. So it shows you where I was going. And I kept writing and writing, and finally an editor at Random House took pity on me. And he called me up and he said, I'm not going to publish anything you've written, but I want you to go read John Grisham and then come back to me in a year. So I went home and I read John Grisham and I read Michael Crichton and I read Robert Ludlum and I read all the thrillers I could find. And I thought, okay, I could try and write a thriller. I could probably do this. And this was sort of the dawn of ER. ER was really hot. So I thought, I'll write a medical thriller. So I wrote a book that turned into my first book, and it was called Threshold. And I'm sure none of you ever heard of it. Don't worry about that. But it was, a medical thriller. My dad helped me out because he was a doctor, so I got all my information from him. And it was about an evil scientist and planting genetic diseases in people. And it was, it didn't do that well, but it was good enough to get me a second book, which was a book called Reaper, which none of you have heard of that one either. And that was about a computer virus that makes the jump to the biological world and people start getting sick from their television sets. And I came up with this idea while watching Oprah, actually. I can say that because the odds of me getting on Oprah are really small. So that idea was sort of just trashy enough to catch the attention of Hollywood. And that actually became a TV movie called Fatal Error, which still airs on the Sci-Fi Channel at about 2 in the morning. And if you see it, you should turn the channel because it stars Antonio Sabato Jr. If you remember him, he was an underwear model from Melrose Place and Calvin Klein. And he plays a surgeon, which was really believable casting. And I remember watching the movie with my dad, who is a doctor. And in the middle of it, Antonio Sabato Jr. leans over this patient's chest and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad turns to me and goes, that's in the head, right? So that was the level of that movie. And I learned sort of the first rule of Hollywood, which is that the writer ranks just below the caterer, because even at the end of the movie, I couldn't get into the wrap party. And I actually had to only get in as Antonio Sabato Jr.'s part of his entourage. So, it shows you where the writer ranks in Hollywood. I went on from there, and I caught the attention of the X-Files. And they had seen Fatal Error, and I guess they liked it. So they asked me to come write for the X-Files. But I didn't want to move to L.A. because at the time I didn't know how to drive. Because, you know, in Boston, you don't really have to know how to drive. And my wife is sitting there. She'd tell you I still don't know how to drive, but I think I'm much better now. But anyways, I said, I don't want to move there, but I'll write a book starring Mulder and Scully. So they said, okay, go ahead. So I wrote an X-Files novel starring Mulder and Scully, and it takes place mostly in Thailand, which I had never been to, and I actually just used a guidebook to write all the Thailand scenes. And it was about a skin transplant gone bad, and all these people were, you know, getting killed by this guy who had gotten a skin transplant from a murderer. So Mulder and Scully are investigating the skin and where it came from. And the book was called Skin, so it shows you how creative I am. And went on from there, and I was really just looking for another thriller idea. And I had no intention of doing nonfiction. And I used to hang out at a bar called Crossroads, which a lot of you probably know Crossroads, which is right basically down the street. And there were these MIT kids who hung out there. And they were your regular MIT kids. I mean, they looked like math science guys. And there was nothing remarkable about them except for they had tons of money. And it was always in $100 bills. And in Boston, you really don't see that many $100 bills. Like, you know, you go to New York, you see $100 bills. You go to Vegas, you see lots of $100 bills. But in Boston, you hardly ever see $100 bills. So I went up to the main guy, who in the book I called Kevin Lewis, and in the real life his name is Jeff Ma. Now that there's a big movie coming out, he wants me to start using his real name. So it's Jeff Ma. I said, Jeff, why do you have so much money? And he said, well, come over to my house. I want to show you something. So I go over to his apartment, and it was in South End, and I go there, and he points to his laundry closet. And I open the closet door, and stacked above his laundry was something like $150,000 in banded stacks of $100 bills. And immediately I assumed he's got to be a drug dealer. But he was this geeky math guy. There's no way this kid was a drug dealer. So I asked him about it, and he said, well, come to Vegas with me. And so 2 days later, I flew to Vegas with Jeff, and there were about 5 of his friends with him. Everybody sat in different seats, pretended they didn't know each other. When we landed in Vegas, there was this limo waiting, and this uniformed limo driver comes over and says, Mr. Kevin Lewis, I have your car. And, of course, his name wasn't Kevin Lewis, so immediately I knew something interesting was going on. And we go to the Hard Rock, and we check into this massive, mega, you know, VIP suite, and we had a butler. We didn't even know what to do with a butler, but we had a butler. And we check in there, and all the other MIT kids come into the room, and they just pull money out from under their clothes. And they had $1 million in cash on them that they had flown America West from Boston to Vegas, carried it on their body, and they stacked it up on the table in the middle of the room and said, we're the MIT Blackjack team. And at the time, there had never been anything written about the MIT Blackjack team. I kind of had heard of it, but I thought it was basically this math class at MIT where people practice blackjack or something. And they told me that basically it had been going on at MIT for 25 years. And it had been handed down from group of students to group of students. I mean, there might be people in here who've played on the MIT Blackjack team. And each new group of students, you know, would train the next one. And they had a bankroll that would also travel from year to year. And it was $1 million bankroll, and they would use that to beat blackjack. And they had won, this group that I was writing about had won between $3 and $6 million. Not positive where it landed, somewhere around $5 million probably, in a period of 2.5 years. And I was blown away by this, because I had been writing these trashy thrillers for the past 2 years, and suddenly this was a true story that was better than any of the stuff I was coming up with on my own. So I just started following the MIT Blackjack team, and I started going every weekend, and I became the money carrier because I wasn't good enough at math to actually count cards. So I would strap all the money to my body. It turns out you can carry about $250,000 under your clothes pretty easily. And, you know, it's not illegal to carry your own money, but if you get caught at Logan Airport with $250,000 on you, it looks really weird. And you end up in a cell underneath the airport, actually, handcuffed, and the DEA comes in and the IRS comes in. And I don't have to tell you how I know that, but I know that. And you spend some time trying to prove that it's your money. So anyways, basically I started following it. And a lot of you probably read Bringing Down the House, so you know the system where they'd spread 6 to 10 college kids out across a casino, one kid sitting at each table, and he would keep track of the cards. And when the cards got good, which meant there were more tens, jack, kings, or queens, or aces in the deck, they would signal the guy called the big player, who's acting like a rich, drunk high roller, and he would walk up to the table and bet $10,000 a hand. Then he'd get the signal it's no longer good, and he would keep walking. So in that way, big money was only being placed down on good decks. And it worked really well, because the casinos couldn't see what was going on. Normally, it's very easy to catch a card counter, because you sit there at the table and you watch the cards, and then you double your bet or you triple your bet. The casino sees you doing it. There's nothing illegal about it, but they frown upon it, and they'll quickly come and throw you out, or worse. But the MIT team would use this big player system, and they were doing it very well. They would actually use the casino's stereotypes against them, because the casinos have this view of what a high roller is supposed to look like. And if a guy who looks like me comes into a casino, a white guy with glasses from Boston, and I come in with $1 million, it looks really strange. But if an Asian kid or a Persian kid comes into a casino with $1 million, they look like a high roller. So the MIT team would recruit as many Asians and Persians as they could, which was actually quite easy to do at MIT. And also it turns out that women can get away with card counting forever because the casinos don't believe women can do math. And I interviewed one girl who was an attractive blonde who would wear a tennis outfit, and she'd carry a tennis racket, and she'd sit at the blackjack table, and she'd pretend that her husband was still playing tennis, and she was so bored. And she was an applied economics major at MIT, but the assumption was she was a dumb blonde, and she could card count right in front of everybody and never get caught. And it also turns out that if there's an attractive woman in a low-cut outfit at a casino, all of those thousands of cameras are actually trained on her. And I was actually in the Venetian security booth once, and all of those screens, they showed a woman walking through the casino and sitting down. And I said, oh, is she going to rob the place? And they're like, no, we just get bored back here. So it's a very sort of, odd system, but they watch women. So the MIT team would recruit as many women as they could. And this was actually much harder for these guys to do. If you knew these guys, you'd know what I was saying. But they would actually end up hiring women. They would hire strippers to sit at the table as a distractor, to keep the cameras on the woman, and they'd be betting $10,000 a hand. Or they would also sit at tables where there were real high rollers like celebrities, because if there's a celebrity at your table, even if he's only betting $100 a hand, the cameras are all on him, and you can be sitting here betting $10,000 a hand, nobody cares. And so they've played with all of the celebrities. It's funny, as we made the movie, I mean, we had played with Kevin Spacey before we knew Kevin Spacey, and people like, Lawrence Fishburne had been sitting at the table before, but they had no idea that MIT kids were sitting with them. So that was kind of cool. But anyways, that was that system, and that was that book. Now, Rigged, which is the book, the new one that's out now, it came about basically after Bringing Down the House came out. I knew this kid who had gone to Harvard Business School. And his real name is John D'Agostino, and he actually let me put his real name in the beginning of the book, but not in the whole book, and I'll get into that a little later. But John was a kid who went to Harvard Business School, and I was friends with his girlfriend. And John was only remarkable to me in that he was this most intense guy I'd ever met. Incredibly ambitious, really intense, one of these guys whose hair is always perfect, and his suit is always perfect, and he's got himself together. He's very, if you know HBS guys, he looked like an HBS guy. Basically, I lost track of him, and a couple of years later, he called me up, and he invited me to ring the bell to open something called the Merck Exchange, to ring the morning bell. I had never heard of the Merck Exchange. I didn't know anything about oil. I didn't know anything about the Merck Exchange. I knew it was in New York, but that was it. So I went over to New York, and I got to this place, and it was that pit that you see in the movie Trading Places, where people are going crazy and yelling at each other. So I basically go in there, and I stand up on this little platform where there's actually a bell, even though there's a real electronic bell that actually rings, but you have a bell. And I look out, and it's this huge sea of guys, mostly tough guys from Brooklyn, mostly Italians and Jews, who have apprenticed their way in. And these guys, they trade oil. And basically it's the biggest casino in the world, where these guys physically shove each other, push each other. They're fighting for territory in this oil trading pit, because where you stand is actually worth more money. And there was actually one old guy that I saw who had hired, he was a little guy, and he kept getting knocked out. So he actually hired 3 clerks whose entire job was to hold him into the trading pit. And so when I saw this, I thought, this is really interesting, and I started following these guys around. And it turns out that these trading spots, for the most part, are handed down, like an apprenticeship system. And this trading floor used to be a potato exchange, then it was a dairy exchange, and now it's an oil exchange. But the families who run it were the same guys from Brooklyn who had been trading potatoes and trading milk, and now they're trading oil. And it was really intense. They're all Italians and Jews from the same streets in Brooklyn that actually my father grew up on, which is kind of cool. And these guys make fortunes, and they're in their early 20s. They didn't go to college, and the exchange ends every day at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So these guys make $500,000 to $1 million by 2 in the afternoon, and then they just go spend it. So New York City becomes their entire party zone. And these guys aren't like Wall Street guys who end up living on Park Avenue or going to the Hamptons. They literally still live on the same block that they grew up in Brooklyn. They park their Ferrari right on the curb, and they basically buy up the townhouse they grew up in and take over all the floors and turn it into a palace, basically. So I thought it was really interesting, and I started to follow these guys around. It turns out that Johnny's story was even more interesting. I wanted to write another story about crazy high rollers, but what Johnny had done was pretty wild. At age 25, he had been made vice president of this entire exchange. partially because his boss wanted to stick it to one of the old traders who didn't like change, but partly because Johnny's a real brilliant, ambitious guy. He was a Harvard business kid who was also from Brooklyn, so he had sort of a foot in two worlds. And as vice president of the exchange, he got invited to Dubai, where he met a young Muslim who basically came up with the idea of creating this exact same exchange in Dubai, in the middle of the Muslim world. So it would be the first real capitalist market in the middle of a place where there really isn't anything like that. And so Johnny started going back and forth to Dubai. A big part of this book is about Dubai and how crazy that world is. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's basically the biggest amusement park in the world now. The sheik who owns Dubai is almost a trillionaire, many billions of dollars, and he realized that in the future they were going to run out of oil at some point. So he decided to take all the oil money he has now and turn his city into this incredible expat playground that is also the center of the new Arab world. And so he's invited so many financial centers there that it's becoming like New York, like Wall Street. And he's also building all these things that you see on 60 Minutes around all these shows. There's the biggest ski slope in the world. It's an indoor ski slope. They're building a biggest building in the world, the biggest hotel in the world. They have two of the biggest shopping malls, the #1 and the #2 biggest shopping malls. They're building those islands that are you can see from space, they say. I'm not sure if that's really true. I actually heard a story that the Emir of Dubai went to Vancouver, and he liked Vancouver so much that he decided he's going to build Vancouver in the desert around Dubai. So they're actually building Vancouver out there now. And it's just insane. I mean, the expats outnumber the people who live there 9-to-1 now. So it's become this incredible expat place. And Johnny realized that this was sort of the next stop for oil. Oil comes from this region anyways. Why not put the exchange there? That exchange just opened this June. The book takes place a little while ago where the idea was formed. He has to start traveling the world to convince. He's got to convince a bunch of Italians and Jews from Brooklyn who didn't go to college, who are there right after 9/11, to partner with Arabs and create an exchange in Dubai. So it's a crazy sort of story, a thing that he attempted. And I don't want to give away, I don't know if any of you read it yet or not. It's only been out a week or so. But I don't want to give it away. But that's the story of Rigged. I thought, at this point I would just open it up to questions because it's, a nice casual group. And if anybody has anything they want to ask about anything or the movie, I guess I should tell you. So the movie we did film right around here. A lot of you probably know that. The movie is called 21. That's of Bringing Down the House. And that comes out I believe March 28th now. And it stars Kevin Spacey as the professor who trains the team of students. Lawrence Fishburne plays the bad guy who's chasing them, and Kate Bosworth is the hot MIT girl. And when I wrote the book, there wasn't really much of a love story in the book, but now in the movie, there's much more of a love story. So I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard that it's fantastic, and I hope it is, and it will come out in March. But if there's any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll call on you at this point. Anybody? Sure.
I have a question that I'm prompted to ask from reading Ugly Americans.
Oh, okay. I didn't even mention that one, yeah.
And what I wondered is, writing is sort of a sedentary occupation,
Right.
and you really describe well, I think, the people that get an adrenaline rush from danger.
Right.
And I just wondered how you were able to do it.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I kind of live a double life, where I'm actually scared of just about everything. And I'm, I'm a writer, and writers, like to hole up in their house with the lights off, and that's why I'm so pale, is I never really go outside. But when I start researching my stories, I become a part of the story. I never set out to be a journalist. I set out to really follow a story and become one of the guys I'm writing about. So, for instance, Ugly Americans takes place in Tokyo in this crazy expat world, or these guys become almost billionaires trading stocks and taking advantage of a bizarre market, and the main character falls in love with the daughter of a Japanese gangster who he meets at a hostess club, and it goes from there. So you can imagine it gets a little wild. I went to Tokyo. I hung out with these guys, for a month or a few weeks, and I become a part of I don't come in with a notebook as if I'm going to write their story. I come in and say, I want to see what it is that you're doing. With Bringing Down the House, I just strapped the money to my body, and I flew to Vegas, and I started joining the team. With Rigged, I became a part of this sort of group of people and just hung out with them. So yeah, there is this, you have to sort of, to capture what it is that they're doing, because I write about adrenaline junkies. I write about people who really get off on getting into danger. Busting Vegas, some of you might have read, is about another MIT kid. I mean, this guy's had a gun pointed at him. He's been thrown out of a car. He's had so many crazy things happen to him. He's a really nice guy, though. If you hung out with him, you'd say, oh, he's a really nice guy. But I'd like to get inside, what drives them to get into those positions. I myself am pretty terrified most of the time I'm doing my research. I remember to do Ugly Americans, I had to interview a Yakuza crime boss in Osaka. And I got to Osaka, and this group of guys said, you're going to interview this guy in this bar, and he's going to be sitting across from you, and there's going to be a table of guys behind you, and you're not allowed to turn around. And I get to this bar, and these guys are all covered in tattoos, and these are guys who, like, cut off their pinky finger and give it to their boss if they do something wrong as a sign of respect. And I mean, these are not the Sopranos. These are some serious gangsters. And you get in there, and you're doing this interview, and there's guys behind you. You're not allowed to look at what they're doing. And it's the worst experience. I don't even know what I asked this guy. It's the worst interview I've ever done. I have no idea what went on. But you just have to sort of throw yourself into it and then see what happens. And then I come back and I hole up in my room and I write and I write and I write. So, there's just two parts of it for me. Anybody else? Sure.
In both or all three of your movies, your books, there were dollar figures. The first guys, they made this amount of money.
Right.
The second one, they made X amount of money. You didn't
Put money in there. And
yeah, and this one.
Yeah. Well,
Any dollar figure?
Yeah. It's interesting. The traders on the trading floor who are trading oil are making fortunes, a few $100,000 a day kind of thing. Some of them are losing fortunes too. But the main character of Rigged, interestingly enough, it wasn't about money. His story wasn't really about making a fortune. It was really about trying to make this Dubai thing happen. He didn't go into it to make money. So I didn't really focus. I mean, they're partying, they're Ferraris, there's Lamborghinis, there's that whole side of the book. But his goal wasn't to go into oil and make a killing on oil. So that really wasn't the angle there. And, it's an interesting question. I mean, it really, in all my other books, there's number figures of how much money is made. This story is more of an adventure story, I think. It's definitely a departure for me in that respect. I mean, he didn't set out to make $10 million in oil. And whether or not he did get rich off of it, I'm not even certain, but he was a part of creating, history in the oil world. And that's kind of what I was writing about.
There are, I would think, enormous political ramifications from being Johnny D'Agostino or
Right.
creating a Merc, a new Merc in Dubai. Are the folks that you've hung out with there or who are playing that in that game, are they political people? Do they have a sense of the politics,
The politics
that
of what's going on.
that are impacting them and that they're impacting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because the people on the trading floor are these incredible, gamblers, essentially. And they don't have any real thought about the rest of the world, about the fact that the price of oil is going crazy, about people can't buy oil. I mean, what they're thinking about is, okay, a weather system's coming towards New York. How is that going to affect the futures market in oil? Or if some sheik shakes the hand of some senator on TV, how is that going to affect the position I have right now in crude? So they're really gamblers who think about it specifically that way. There are, of course, huge issues involved in creating sort of an exchange in Dubai. Then you have to start thinking about what is this going to mean to the world? Is this going to change the Middle East in a good way or a bad way? Is this going to create peace or is this going to create more war? Those questions come into that aspect of it. But in terms of the traders, no. And I got asked today on a radio interview, I mean, should I hate these people because they're making all this money off of the misery of oil in a lot of ways? But no, what they're doing is essentially creating a secondary market, a middleman market that really, it affects things, but it doesn't drive things. It doesn't create the price of oil. It sort of reacts to the price of oil. And yeah, their bidding up and down does affect it a little bit, but the reason that oil is at almost 100 isn't because of them. The reason, there are other bigger reasons. The differences between 97 and 99 might be because of them, but not the differences between 60 and 100. So it's a good question. I think that these guys who trade oil know the politics doesn't even enter into their thought processes. I mean, these guys are not that type of guy. But in terms of the people who own and run the exchanges and the people in Dubai who are creating the exchanges, they are thinking forward to what it's going to bring to the future. Yeah. Yeah. Do you wanna?
No, you just answered the question.
Oh.
I was going to ask how much of an influence do these men have in
the price of oil.
In the price of
basically.
oil.
Yeah, I mean, they are really, the way Johnny explained it to me is that they create sort of a liquidity in that you can move all these future barrels of oil because they're there and because people are buying and selling it. And without that, everything sort of grinds more to a halt because you can only move what you have. But I don't know. I'm not necessarily that, knowledgeable and to be able to tell you whether what they do is good or what they do is bad.
Are these individuals friends?
It's really a closed system in that they apprentice their way in, so it's family almost. I mean, you'll have a trader who owns this spot on the exchange who hires his cousin and then his cousin's kid and then his cousin's kid's friend. And they really do all know each other, and they're all from like 2 blocks in Brooklyn. There are also traders who work for major companies who are brought in, but there's this division, and what I really focused on were these sort of tough guy families who run a large part of the exchange.
These people whose story you're telling, do you find that what's their sort of motivation in having you bring you in and have
And let me tell their story
Yeah.
and ruin their lives? No, with the MIT kids, the way they thought of it was that they had done this incredible thing, nobody knew anything about it, and it was like playing a professional sport, but no one had ever seen you play it. So they kind of wanted people to know their story. But they didn't want their names in it at first because they were worried to be known as the kids who played blackjack. Because the book was well received and not negatively received, suddenly now they want to take advantage of that and they want to be a part of it. Rigged was tricky. And when I sat down to write Rigged, Johnny said, I don't want you using my name. So I made up a name, David Russo, and the whole book, the character's name is David Russo. Then when I finished the book, I gave it to Johnny and he read it, and I said, I'd really like you to write an afterword that's more technical for some people who might be interested in that. And I think you should put your real name in it because this is kind of cool. The Dubai Exchange is really opening now, so why don't you just say who you are? And he thought about it and he said, okay, you can use my name in the forward and the afterword. So it's kind of a weird nonfiction book in that the bulk of the book is written with a fake name, and then his real name is in the beginning and end, and so he can do interviews as well and tell people about it. But it's tricky. When Ugly Americans, they had a different experience where didn't want me using his name, wanted me to disguise who he was. I wrote the book, and then CNN decided to try and figure out who he was. And the Wall Street Journal, a lot of people sent, reporters, and they found him, and he got very upset because he's, running away from the Yakuza and started a billion-dollar hedge fund. He didn't want people to know who he was. So he called me up and said, I want you to erase me from your email list, erase me from your, phone, pretend you never knew me. And I literally didn't see him for 2 years. And then I was actually in the airport. We sold Ugly Americans to DreamWorks. So we were scouting locations in Tokyo, and I was in the Tokyo airport, and he was there. And I said, hey, hi, we're making a movie. And he goes, I know everything about it. He just walked right by. But he's actually called me in recent weeks and said, I don't hate you. I like you. Everything's great. I love the book. We're all fine. We just don't, have a lot of interaction anymore. So you get different reactions. I mean, it's definitely, I've stayed friends with all the MIT kids. I see them, they're always around, and they're fun guys. And Johnny and I are friends, with Rigged and everything like that. But, you never know where the future's going to go, especially as a movie comes out. It's such a bigger thing that you'd have no idea what's going to happen after that. So, yeah.
So this may be a little too early to ask. You've already done a book on hedge funds, oil, gambling. What's the next project?
What's the next book? That's a really good question. I've been working on a couple projects. I mean, the movie's going to take up a lot. I'm going to be involved in touring, and we're going to put out a new paperback, with the movie. So I'm going to be involved through probably March on that. I'm going to do I have another nonfiction story I'm working on right now, and it's about a kid from Boston. But I don't really want to give away too much. But it's kind of about what the new American dream is. Because I think the American dream has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And my parents' American dream is very different than my friend's American dream. And it's kind of about that. So it kind of intersects with all the stuff I've written. But, yeah, I don't want to give it away. It's going to be another one of my stories, though.
Do the people at MIT still go to Vegas? And second of all, did the IRS become involved with them shortly after the book was
The IRS became involved actually before the book came out. These guys were audited a couple times. And because you declare your winnings in that other category, and when you have $2 million in the other category, people start to wonder what's going on. So they didn't do anything illegal, these guys. They were really very careful about the IRS because that's where you go down. The kids at MIT still do this. There's still an MIT blackjack team. One of the kids from Bringing Down the House is involved as a teacher to them. And I spoke at MIT just a month ago about something, and this kid came up to me and said that they had actually figured out how to crack some of the Mass State scratch tickets. Because one of the scratch tickets, it turns out, as the money gets bigger and bigger, there comes a point when buying a certain amount becomes mathematically advantageous, so they had put together $600,000 in investment money, and they were buying it, and they had made $1.25 million in a period of a year. So I'm probably ruining their scheme right now, but they said they were pretty much done with it. But MIT kids, they keep coming up with it, and it's not just MIT. I know Caltech has a team that plays blackjack. There's an Australian team. There's a European team. I don't know if there's a BU team. I don't know a lot of kids in the math department at BU, but it's possible. I mean, a lot of college kids do it, and it's funny because I go to Vegas a lot, and you will see kids using the system. You'll notice kids, signaling each other in the hat and like calling each other in and out. And I guarantee you 90% of them are really bad at it. And that's the funny thing. I've been there with Jeff, the main character, and he's looking around and he goes, "Oh, that guy's bad. He's going to get killed." And it's really funny to watch. But if you go on a crazy weekend, like a 4th of July weekend to the Bellagio, I guarantee you you'll see 1 or 2 kids trying it out. Sure.
Has there been a story that somebody's approached you to tell? And you said, "No way"?
Oh, yeah. There's been plenty of those. There was one group of kids who wanted to hit the Moscow casino. And I said, "There's no way I want anything to do with that. You get caught there, and that's your own problem." And then, I get the weirdest phone calls. I got a guy who called me up, and he said that he knew where the Fogg Art Museum art was. Knew where, not the Fogg, the Gardner Museum, that he was involved. And I was like, "No, you don't." And I started to sort of check up on him, and he had just been released from 12 years in prison for robbing a museum in the exact same way that museum had been robbed, down to every detail. So I started thinking, okay, maybe he does know. And so I call him back, and he makes me call him at payphones. It was that kind of thing. And he says, "I want to meet you. I'm on parole, so I'm not allowed out of California, but I'm going to meet you in South Boston." And he named some alley. And I'm like, you know what? No, I'm not going that direction. I mean, another writer probably would have, but I stopped there. And then I got a call. I got an email from someone in China who said that he had found the world's largest brothel, and that it was a Sheraton hotel, and that every room had a different woman in it. But I wasn't going to go out there and research that one. I get these questions all the time. I mean, they're pretty crazy. And I actually keep a phone that's listed, but there's no phone attached to it. At the end of each week, I check all the messages to see what crazy stories there are. And every now and then there's a good story, but 99% of them are, you just can't follow up on them. Sure.
You just mentioned China.
Right.
I mean, that's a big game right now.
Yeah,
That's a big bubble right now. Different kind of system of justice.
Right.
There's no IRS, but there's a lot of this.
Right.
Anybody approach you about doing a story about the big game in China?
Well, I mean, China is an interesting area, and I've definitely been approached with different stories that take place all over there. In just the casino world, I mean, what they've done with Macau is just out of control. It's twice the size of Vegas, and it's, they're building hotels, the largest casinos in the world. That's going to be much, much bigger than Vegas. But I haven't really found an angle. I mean, my stories all are really American stories with American characters. So I haven't really found the story I want to do. There was a murder in Hong Kong that I thought about talking about that actually is McGinnis just did a book on it, I think. But I don't do crime, really. It's not.
Chinese stock market.
Oh, the Chinese stock market.
And the Chinese
yeah,
Vegas
I mean, I'm
game.
sure there's a great story there. I just, I probably won't, but maybe one day. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I just want to thank you all. I'm going to sign whatever you want me to sign, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and thanks so much. I came up with this idea while watching Oprah, actually. I can say that because the odds of me getting on Oprah are really small. So that idea was sort of just trashy enough to catch the attention of Hollywood. And that actually became a TV movie called Fatal Error, which still airs on the Sci-Fi Channel at about 2 in the morning. And if you see it, you should turn the channel because it stars Antonio Sabato Jr. If you remember him, he was an underwear model from Melrose Place and Calvin Klein. And he plays a surgeon, which was a really believable casting. And I remember watching the movie with my dad, who is a doctor, and in the middle of it, Antonio Sabato Jr. leans over this patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad turns to me and goes, "That's in the head, right?" So that was the level of that movie. And I learned sort of the first rule of Hollywood, which is that the writer ranks just below the caterer because
Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming out to the Barnes & Noble at BU tonight. New York Times bestselling author of Bringing Down the House joins us to talk about his newest release, Rig, the true story of an Ivy League kid who changed the world of oil from Wall Street to Dubai, which debuted on several bestseller lists. A self-described method writer, Ben Mezrich never intended to write a book about oil. As he states in his author's note, the stories that turn him on usually involve brilliant young kids pulling off incredible schemes. Wads of cash strapped to backs, Ferraris, and long-legged models and locales so exotic that I need the internet to help me find them on a map, quote. But a chance meeting with a Harvard Business School student named John D'Agostino led to a story he couldn't resist. Rigged is a story of the Merc Exchange, hotel palaces in Dubai, yachts with girls flown in by Saudi sheiks, and dangerous back alley dealings. Named People magazine's sex...
And finally, an editor at Random House took pity on me. And he called me up and he said, you know, I'm not going to publish anything you've written, but I want you to go read John Grisham and then come back to me in a year. So I went home and I read John Grisham and I read Michael Crichton and I read Robert Ludlum and I read all the thrillers I could find. And I thought, okay, I could try and write a thriller. I could probably do this. And this was sort of the dawn of ER. ER was really hot. So I thought, I'll write a medical thriller. So I wrote a book that turned into my first book, and it was called Threshold. And I'm sure none of you ever heard of it. Don't worry about that. But it was, you know, a medical thriller. My dad helped me out because he was a doctor, so I got all my information from him. And it was about an evil scientist and planting genetic diseases in people. And it was, you know, it didn't do that well, but it was good enough to get me a second book, which was a book called Reaper, which none of you have heard of that one either. And that was about a computer virus that makes the jump to the biological world, and people start getting sick from their television sets. And bad television, and I was into People magazine and Us Weekly and stuff like that. And when I sat down, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. So I actually graduated from Harvard, and I locked myself in an apartment on Marlborough Street in Back Bay. And I just started writing, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I wrote about 9 novels in about a year and a half. And they were all really bad. They were deep, dark, trashy novels that took place in bars in New York City. Because at the time I was reading a lot of Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney, and I thought, that's the kind of books, you know, people read. And it really wasn't true. And I was sending them out and getting rejected and getting rejected. And I got about 190 rejection slips in a period of 2 years. Rejected by everybody in New York. I was even rejected by a janitor once because I sent a manuscript to an editor who was no longer working at a publishing house, and it ended up in the garbage, and the janitor took it out and read it and then rejected me. So it shows you where I was going. And I kept writing and writing.
Author, Ben Mezrich has written 9 books, including the bestsellers Bringing Down the House and Ugly Americans. In fact, Bringing Down the House was the basis for the 2008 Kevin Spacey movie 21 that was filmed here at BU. Ben Mezrich is a columnist for Stuff magazine and Boston Common, as well as a contributor to the UK magazine Flush. Please welcome Ben Mezrich.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And if you're wondering about the People magazine Sexiest Man thing, it's not that hard a competition. If you look at the other authors that I was competing against, it wasn't that rough. But rather than do a reading, I thought I was just going to tell you about how I got to here, how I got to writing Rigged. Which is kind of a departure for me because it's kind of political and serious, and I usually write pretty non-serious stuff. But I never set out to be a nonfiction writer. I never liked nonfiction. I always hated nonfiction. I used to watch really